Inside the Oval Office, surrounded by Europe's most powerful leaders, President Donald Trump abruptly placed his phone on the table, signaled for the meeting to pause, and demanded an immediate connection with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The call lasted nearly 40 minutes, but its aftershocks rippled across the global political chessboard. Many had expected Trump to deliberate with Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, Rishi Sunak, Giorgia Meloni, or the EU leadership. Instead, he bypassed them all to speak directly with his biggest rival. With a single dial, Trump reduced Europe's heads of state to unwilling spectators. Even Volodymyr Zelensky, who had arrived in Washington backed by a formidable European entourage to press his case, was sidelined, forced to listen silently as his fate was discussed without him. Trump's move raised an unmistakable question. Was he signaling that the war in Ukraine had only two real players, the United States and Russia, while Europe remained little more than an audience? On the afternoon of the 18th Washington time, Trump stunned the world by cutting short his summit with European leaders in order to call Putin directly. The call was originally scheduled for later, but Trump insisted on making it immediately. Even with Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Finland, and the European Union gathered in the room alongside Zelensky. What was meant to be a collective show of European unity suddenly became a stage for Trump's unilateral diplomacy. Zelensky had not come to Washington alone. He brought with him a phalanx of allies: France's Macron, Germany's Scholz, Britain's Sunak, Italy's Meloni, Finland's Alexander Stubb, and EU leaders Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen. Even NATO, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. His goal was clear: to box Trump in, to make it politically impossible for the United States to strike any deal with Moscow that sidelined Ukraine or ignored Europe. For Zelensky, this was never intended as a bilateral meeting with the U.S. president. It was meant to be a collective show of force, a way to ensure Washington could not act alone. The Europeans, too, had their own aims: to demonstrate Brussels as the true center of the peace process, and to keep America bound within their framework. NATO, meanwhile, had every incentive to see the conflict drag on. It justified defense budgets and kept Washington tethered to Europe's security. But Trump is no ordinary U.S. president. He has never been one to sit quietly while allies lecture him about collective obligations. He sees politics through the lens of a deal maker, and from his vantage point, Zelensky looked weak, leaning heavily on his European backers. The EU looked eager to offload costs onto Washington. NATO looked like a body that lived off perpetual conflict. Remaining in that room meant letting others dictate the terms. So Trump broke the script. By calling Putin in front of everyone, he shattered the European choreography. His message was simple: I, not Brussels, hold the key to peace. Ukraine cannot move without me, and Putin cannot ignore me. The symbolism of the call. The contents of the 40-minute conversation remain secret, but sources suggest Trump wanted to hear Putin's position firsthand to gauge how far Moscow was willing to go for a deal. In that instant, Europe lost its central role. Zelensky, seated in the Oval Office itself, was reduced to a passive listener, reminded that Ukraine's fate ultimately hinged on Washington and Moscow. Putin, thousands of miles away, gained a symbolic triumph, treated as Trump's direct equal without EU mediation. For Trump's American base, the optics were powerful. He could now say, I am the only one bold enough to call Putin directly, the only one who can end this war. It was a message that resonated with millions of voters weary of watching tens of billions in U.S. tax dollars flow to Ukraine with no end in sight. To them, what Europe or NATO wanted was irrelevant. What mattered was stopping the bloodshed and halting America's financial drain. Trump understood this sentiment better than anyone, and he leveraged the surprise phone call as a symbol of his strength. A leader willing to do what others would not. For Europe, it was a humiliating blow. EU leaders feared that if Trump and Putin struck a bilateral accord, the painstaking diplomatic process built in Brussels would collapse, leaving them as mere bystanders. For Zelensky, it was existential. A U.S.-Russia deal could force Kiev into a ceasefire that locks in Russia's territorial gains. For NATO, it was a threat to its very rationale. If the war ended swiftly, the alliance would lose both its momentum and its hold on U.S. engagement. Trump's gesture carried three clear messages. To Europe and Zelensky, you don't set the pace, I do. To Putin, you are my equal partner. Washington and Moscow can negotiate directly. To the American electorate, I will end the war differently, boldly, and without draining U.S. resources. The call did not yield an agreement, but it set a new direction. It signaled Trump's willingness to bypass Brussels, skip multilateral diplomacy, and pursue a rapid, bilateral peace, what some are already calling a Trump peace. Europe will resist, Zelensky will worry about abandonment, NATO will scramble to tighten its grip, and Western media will unleash criticism. But at home, Trump stands to gain valuable political capital from voters who care less about Europe's unity than about keeping American money and blood away from a distant battlefield. When the meeting ended, EU leaders sat in shock, and Zelensky left the White House visibly unsettled. The message was unmistakable. Trump will not be bound by allies. He has chosen his own unpredictable path. In that moment, the Ukraine war entered a new chapter, one where a single phone call could tilt the entire balance of diplomacy. The question now is whether Trump's version of peace, a settlement forged directly with Moscow, will materialize, or whether this was simply another move in a long, unfinished game.